privilege of getting up close to the Blackaby family. And the one thing I appreciate about Henry and that I see in Richard is that they're just genuine people. They're not those kind of people that blow in, blow up, and blow out. You know, they're just like, that's the deal. And, you know, for somebody who's had impact all over the globe, who's had a study that's in, 80 languages or so and affected millions of people, right now, Frank Kelly is in prison because of experiencing God right now. That's right. Because he's over at Broad River, I think, today. And some of you are going later this afternoon. And I'm so thankful to see that being used in that way, because it's used around the globe in prison ministry specifically, and as well as churches, of course. But I want you to make him welcome, and he'll have a word for us that will meet you right where you are in your journey. So let's give a Lexington Baptist welcome to my friend and colleague, Richard.
Well, it is wonderful to be with you, and as Rick said, I remember when I came the first time, and he alluded to this, but as I was flying from Canada down here to be in this meeting and to meet Rick for the first time, I had to fly through Chicago, and landed in Chicago from Canada, and then it was time to go from Chicago to here. And so my plane lifted off in Chicago, was going up in the clouds, and then our little regional plane was struck by a major lightning strike. And of course I was coming here to do a prayer conference, and I feel like God wanted to prepare my prayer life for that conference. And so the flight attendant actually had to come and check the engines to see if any smoke was coming out. And when we landed in Columbia Airport, the flight attendant said, well, folks, the pilots and I have never had an experience like that before, and we hope we never do again. And that happened just before I met Rick for the first time. And so when you know it, as I was going to the airport yesterday to come here, there was a thunderstorm taking place. I thought, oh no, I'm not ready for another lightning strike. So all it was a 2-hour delay this time, though. So, but I remember fondly that time with you, and it's great to be back. And those of you that know Rick, you'll know just how to be praying for me as I travel the world with him. But what a blessing to get to be with him and to minister together, and just to see how God uses him as well. And I suppose some of you occasionally have doctor's appointments. Any of you been to the doctor in the last 6 months or so? I had no idea that, I've got a friend who says as you get older, he says your refrigerator has either pictures of grandkids or reminders of doctor's appointments on it, and you want to kind of keep up with both. But I think sometimes these kind of meetings are a lot like those doctor's appointments. Sometimes you go to the doctor not even because anything's wrong, it's just time for a checkup, right? And when you get to the doctor's office, he does some of the same things every time. Weighs you, checks your blood pressure, and so on, and just kind of asks some general questions just to make sure everything's good. And I think sometimes we can be so concerned about our physical well-being that we ought to be even more concerned about our spiritual health, should we not? And they're just ways, just like physically, you can start having these little nagging issues that start creeping up. Little ache, little pain, and you don't think much of it, but you neglect it and it just gets worse and worse. And I find that the same happens spiritually as well, where maybe I'm just getting, my temper is not what it ought to be. Things are irritating me. People are irritating me that didn't used to do that. I'm having a hard time getting up and spending time with the Lord in prayer and Scripture. I used to love doing that, and it just hasn't been quite the same. Maybe you go to worship service, and you're still showing up like you always have, but you look around and other people are being deeply impacted by what's being preached and the worship and the singing, and you're wondering what you're missing. Why is it not affecting me? And you begin to realize maybe those are symptoms. Maybe my spiritual health needs a little checkup as well. And so I pray that just as we're together, while I'm with you today and tomorrow, then Rick will be speaking, that you'll just invite the Holy Spirit like a spiritual physician to say, am I spiritually healthy right now? I don't want to just get by spiritually. I want to be healthy spiritually. And I have to tell you, I don't know, there's a lot of great things about getting older. I'm older than I was the last time I was here with you. But there's a lot of benefits. Hopefully you're wiser than you used to be. You have more experience. You get the occasional discount as a senior citizen. I remember being kind of offended the first time someone at the counter asked if I qualified for a senior discount. And until I found out how much it was for. And then I said, no, I'm always asking, are there any discounts? But it's not all good. I'm finding I've got more aches and pains than I used to have. Any of you have the occasional ache or pain? Last fall, the spring and the fall particularly are really busy for me. And so last fall, Rick and I were traveling all over the place. I was just really, really busy. And I was really looking forward. In December, things kind of slowed down into the Christmas season for me. And I was just anxious to kind of be able to be at home for a bit and just kind of rest up and get healthy. And around the beginning of December, my back just went out on me. I discovered I still have an extremely herniated disc in the lower part of my back. And I guess it had been an issue for a while, but it just kind of went out on me. And I'm sure some of you have had those disc issues in your back. And pain medicines did nothing for it. And it got to where I couldn't just stand straight up. I had to, you bend over, you're trying to find a position that doesn't hurt. And lying down was painful. When I laid down, being straight, whether it was up or lying down, didn't matter, it hurt. But the only way it didn't hurt a lot was when I sat down. So if I'm sitting down, it was a little bit more bearable. And so all of a sudden, I just walking, my left leg had gone numb on me. And so I could walk, but it was like my left leg was just dead weight. It wasn't doing what it's supposed to do, and I was just a disaster. And so, it's one thing to have the joy of the Lord when you feel great, isn't it? When there's no pain, everything feels good. It's easy to worship God and have joy and be upbeat and positive. But when you're in constant pain, that's another story, isn't it? It's one thing just to want to talk to people about Jesus all the time when you feel great, but when your back is in constant pain, you want to talk to people about your back pain more than about Jesus, don't you? And so I was kind of in this place where it was real painful. And so I got to church, and I'm home now, so I'm home on Sundays and in December. And I remember sitting there up in the balcony with my family, two of my kids go to that church, but it's time to stand up and sing. And don't you appreciate the worship leaders who all want you to stand when you sing? And so I just thought, oh, it's going to hurt. I'm sitting in a place that doesn't hurt too much. Now I got to stand up and sing. And so I'm up in the balcony where not many people can see me anyway. I thought, I'm just not going to stand up. Now, normally I always obey. I always do what you're supposed to do. But I just thought, I'm in so much pain here. I'll just hurt. I'll be hunched over. But I'm just going to stay sitting. So I did. And that worked a little better for me during the service. So the next Sunday, I figure, as long as I got this back pain, I'm just going to kind of stay seated. But the problem was that Sunday, my granddaughter, Claire, who's 5 years old, her normal place, she normally goes to a kids' church, but they didn't have kids' church that day. So she's up with us in the balcony. We got a picture of my two. That's Claire, the older one on the right, and her little sister, Alice. And so they go to our church. I make a beeline to the nursery after every service, just so I can help her. I picked up little Alice on the left there just this past Sunday. And so Claire, the older one, she doesn't normally get to be in big church, and so she's quite a curious child. She's actually a brilliant little girl, and she's always observing, and she's always watching the adults, the grown-ups. And so she's not normally in big church, so she wants to know you know, the big people do in big church. And so, and she decides to sit right next to me. And so that's all great. I've got little Claire here sitting next to me. But now it's time to sing. And then, so of course they say, oh, everyone stand. Now I plan to sit. And so Claire is a rule follower. She's 5, and she's like the teacher's pet. Teacher loves her. She's does everything right. And so she stands, of course, and then she turns, and I'm still sitting, because I'm just going to sit. But Claire is like, wait a minute, they just told us to stand. Why is Grandpa sitting? And I'm trying to explain to her about lower disc issues and herniated discs, right? And I'm like, all she knows is the whole church is standing to worship God, and Grandpa's still sitting. And I realize I'm torn here, because it's going to hurt if I stand up. But I've got a 5-year-old watching firsthand how Grandpa worships God. And so I thought to myself, if I can't get up, that's one thing. I can't get up if I need to. So I decide I'm going to stand up. So I kind of grab the front of the pew. It's pretty visible looking sight, but I get up. But she can't really read real well yet, so she can't read the words up there. And so she turns to me and she holds her hand. She wants me to hold her. And I'm like, oh Lord. My back doctor by that time told me I shouldn't lift more than 8 pounds. And her mother, my daughter, is sitting in the row just ahead of us. And she's checking back on her daughter, and she sees her daughter asking to be picked up. And my daughter goes, no, Dad, no, don't lift her up, don't do that. But I thought, but my granddaughter wants to worship God with me. And so I just prayed for strength. And I reached out and I picked her up, and she had no idea how much pain I was in. But I held her, we were cheek to cheek. And I just belted out the word. And she listened to me sing the words, so she knew what words to sing. And she's singing right along with me. And I'll tell you what, it was one of the most glorious moments for me. I didn't care about the pain at that point. Because the last thing I want my 5-year-old granddaughter to think is that when you become an old Christian, you just get cranky. The old folks are the ones that don't even smile during the worship time, right? Like, I don't want that to be the image that my grandkids have of me. Now, I'm a terrible singer. I've got a terrible singing voice, but I belted it out, and she's singing right with me. And I just felt like, if I've got to just kind of get a tow, rope to pull me up so I can be there worshiping God, when that generation of grandkids are watching me, I want my grandkids to say, boy, I tell you what, when they start worshiping God, Grandpa gets a little crazy. Well, I tell you what, he can't wipe the smile off his face when you start singing about it, how wonderful. By the way, Karen, that's one of my favorite all-time songs. And so when I heard you were singing that this morning, that was awesome. I almost started to try to do Larnell's part with you there, but I don't think you're good enough to carry me singing a duet with you, so I didn't. But I'll tell you what I've learned is, I want to talk to you about 2 things this morning. One is, when you get a little bit further down the road in life, there are some tests and trials that you go through. It's just natural with getting older. It is stuff that we all have to face. But you know what? There's also a younger generation watching those trials. They're watching how we handle the adversity that we carry with us. And my granddaughter, I know full well what she would have said. If I hadn't gotten up, she would have said, but Grandpa, we're worshiping God. I thought you always told me that was the best thing you could possibly do. Why weren't you worshiping? You always told me that you love God with all your heart. Why were you frowning when everybody else was worshiping? I just didn't want that. And so I just said, God, give me strength. But I want to give the right example to the generation coming behind me. And so I want you just to look at a passage this morning. It's a very well-known passage. You know it well. But of late, the Lord has just been using it to speak to me. It's found in Genesis chapter 22. And you know this story well. Let me just read a little bit of it for you, and then just apply it to you for a moment. And it begins in chapter 22 of Genesis and says, after these things, God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he answered. Take your son, he said, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, my father. And he replied, here I am, my son. Isaac said, isn't it interesting, by the way, Abraham, when God calls, he's right, he's there. He's available, as we saw with Moses this morning. Isn't it great when God says Abraham, he only has to call him once, and right away is the response, here I am, here I am. Do you know what is also really awesome? When his son calls for him, he's there too. I'll tell you what, I think that's what the call of a godly man or woman is. You're there for God, you're there for your family. And Abraham is there for both. And so it says, Isaac said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Doesn't that cut you right to the heart? His son, who's going to be the sacrifice, is saying, Dad, where's the sacrifice? I'll tell you what, I think I would have lost it right then. If I hadn't lost it already, I would have lost it right then. Trying to explain to your son why you don't have an offering, a lamb that you're bringing with you. And Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Then the 2 of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told them about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. By the way, you know, it's interesting there. The first time he calls him, he just uses his name once, doesn't he? Now he uses his name twice. If your mom ever used your name twice, what did that mean? Or if she used your full name, including your middle name, you knew that wasn't good, right? You know, I think it's interesting. I think the reason God calls his name twice here is because he wants to make sure, he wants to stop, right? He doesn't want him to go on and kill his son. God doesn't want him to do that for real. Just want to know if he'd be willing. And so he calls Abraham twice just to make sure he's got his attention. Stop. Don't do that. He's protecting Isaac. But normally, how many times did God have to call Abraham to get his attention? Normally once, right? And I thought to myself, how many times does God have to call me before he gets my attention? How loud does he have to raise his voice before he gets my attention? Folks, I'll tell you something. A lot of us in this room have been walking with Jesus a long time. At this point in our walk with God, God ought to just be able to whisper our name once. And ought to be able to hear, here I am, Lord. We ought to know that voice so well that he doesn't have to keep repeating over and over, Richard, Richard, Richard. He might have had to do that when I first started walking with him, but at this point, he ought to only have to use our name once. And so, but he uses it twice here because he wants to make sure he stops him. And then he said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. And so I want you just to look, you know the rest of that story, but I want you just to look for a moment at just a couple of things that the Lord has just particularly been speaking to me about of late. And you notice there, the very first verse, it says, after these things. And so you have to say, well, after what things? When a chapter begins by saying after these things, you realize it's coming after something else. By the way, everything God does in your life is built on what's happened before. If you've been disobedient your whole life, guess what? The next thing God does in your life will be based on your disobedience. If you've ignored God over and over again, the next time you hear from him, he's going to speak with his loud voice. But when you've been obedient all of your life, that invites God to come into your life and act a different way. And so it says after these things. In other words, based on everything Abraham has done up to that point, now God's going to come with a brand new encounter with him. And of course, if you think back to all that has happened with Abraham, he was living in Haran with his family, his relatives. And God had said, leave your family, leave all that you know, and follow me to a land that I'll show you. And then you remember a drought hit in Canaan, and he had to, he went off to Egypt for a while, got into some trouble down there. And then remember that there was not enough grazing land for all of Lot's herds and his herds. And Abraham was very gracious and let the young whippersnapper get first pick. And he said, listen, I'll go, it doesn't matter to me, I'll take the desert if you don't want to go there. And there he was in the desert. And then remember, an evil king had come and kidnapped Lot and his family. And Abraham had to race all the way to the northern part of Israel with his hired men and fight against 5 different kings or so to rescue his nephew. And then, of course, there was the time with Sodom and Gomorrah, where he interceded for Sodom. And there was the time when he got distracted by Hagar and ended up having the son Ishmael. Kind of an embarrassing moment in his life. And there were some awesome encounters with God along the way, wasn't there? And then after all that, at 100 years old, he finally, his wife of 90, gives birth to the child of promise, Isaac. So when it says after these things, you realize this man has had a lot of things that have happened in his life. God has done a lot in his life. And he's also become very successful as a businessman. He's made a lot of money. He's rich. And by this time, he's probably been married to his wife for 70, 80 years. I'll tell you what, that's an accomplishment, isn't it? If you've been married 80 years, you've given birth to a miracle child. You've been very successful in business. You've had a few failures, a few times you fell on your face, but for the most part, you walked with God. In fact, the Bible ultimately is going to call Abraham a friend of God. If you've walked with God in such a way that he calls you his friend, you can pretty well say successful life, right? You could say, would you not? And by this time, we assume that Abraham may be at least 110 years old, might be 115 years old. How do we know that he's around 115? Well, we basically know because Isaac is going to be big enough to carry a load of wood up a mountain, right? A baby can't do that. So we're trying to think, how old would Isaac have to be to take all the wood for the fire and carry it up a mountain? So at least 10, probably maybe 15. Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. So Abraham's maybe 115 years old. If you're 115 and you've done all that Abraham has done, aren't you thinking it's time just to retire? Aren't you thinking it's just, I can coast into heaven at this point? Let the younger folks, do all that stuff at church. Let the younger people have their victories with God, but I've got them all. I've got a whole resume of faithfulness to God. But can I suggest to you, you'll never get so old that God does not have something new for you. You can't ever say, I aged out, and now God's just working with the younger folks, not with people like me. Abraham may be 115, and he's about to have the most severe test he's ever had in his life. Why would God wait until he's 115, a senior citizen, before God gives him the greatest test of his life? Well, I suspect, for one, he wouldn't have passed the test earlier. He didn't know God well enough earlier. God sometimes, you know what I've discovered? Sometimes the hardest tests you may ever face are going to come later in life, not earlier in life. Sometimes God saves some of the really difficult challenges until later. He knows we couldn't have handled them as a young man or young woman, but now we know God well enough. And so it says God, now at that age, God's going to test him. And God said to him, Abraham, here am I, Lord. He said, take your son. By the way, notice in that one verse, he describes Isaac 4 different ways. He says, take your son, when he's only got one son living at home with him. Your only son, God says. In case you're thinking, maybe I mean Ishmael. Isaac, he names the son. Then he says, the one you love, in case you forget. Isaac, God in 4 different ways makes sure there's no misunderstanding what God's saying. Why does he make it so clear? Because what he's going to ask him is going to seem utterly impossible. I want you to take that only son of yours, and I want you to take him to Moriah, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. Now you remember, Abraham waited 25 years for that son. Now he's had him for maybe 15 years. And you can imagine how he's just savoring this son of his and enjoying fellowship with this son. And now God comes and he tests him and he says, I want you to take that which is the most precious to you and I want you to sacrifice it. Now when we read this now in our day, it sounds crazy, right? In fact, there's many who just adamantly will say, God would never have done that. I know it's in the Bible, I just can't believe God would do that. There's people that just have real difficulty with this chapter in the Bible. But you have to understand a couple of things about this. One is, God never does actually make him kill his son. We should recognize that. He finds out if he'd be willing to, but there's nowhere in the Bible he ever tells a parent, just go, by the way, just prove your love to me, kill that son of yours. He never does that. But you remember, in this day, in this culture in which Abraham lived, it was done. Pagan worshipers, pagan people had their gods. The god Moloch in particular. That was how you worshipped him. You went to worship Moloch, you brought one of your kids and you sacrificed him on an altar so that Moloch would bless your crops. You'd have a bumper crop or you'd do well in business. And so Abraham's neighbors may well have sacrificed a child to their God. And what God is saying is, number one, do you love me as much as your neighbors love their false gods? If they're willing to sacrifice their children to a false god, how committed are you to me? By the way, sometimes I wonder if God would not say, even to us, is there anything in your life that you love more than me? Now, we know the answer should be no, right? But there are times where I honestly wonder if some Christians love God as much as they love college football. Now, there's nothing wrong with loving football, right? But I know people that would literally spend hundreds of dollars to go watch the homecoming game. And they would begrudge the fact of putting a check in the offering plate to God. I know people that would read every page after page of stock market reports, but they could go months and not read one chapter of the Bible. God would say, I know people that would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go hunting or fishing, but they think getting to church by 9:30 in the morning to go to Bible study is too great a sacrifice. Folks, I tell you, God would say, just how much do you really love me? Let's find out. Even your neighbors are willing to make a commitment of their own children to me. Are you even as committed as unbelievers are to their God? By the way, when you watch the Olympics, isn't it fascinating to watch people spend an entire lifetime training, sometimes for one Olympics, that they might not even qualify for the final round? And yet, day after day, morning after morning, weekend after weekend, sacrificing and watching what they eat and lifting weights and training and getting coaches so that physically they can be at their best. And I always, when I watch the Olympics, I really admire people that can be physically so disciplined. But I often think to myself, what if Christians were that serious about their spiritual health? if we were more as disciplined as the athletes were in our prayer life, instead of the high jump, instead of the marathon? What if we wanted to be the best witness we could be, the best prayers we could be? Olympic level prayers and intercessors. What if we see other people serious about just competing in games? And God might look at us and say, but in your walk with me, how serious are you? And so what God is saying to Abraham is, now that you've walked with me for over 100 years, it's time we're going to have a test. And that test, by the way, that test is going to involve going to an altar. Can I tell you something? There's a reason that every time you want to go deeper with God, that you have to go to an altar. And that's because the only reason that you're not having a deeper walk with God right now is because there's something in your life holding you back. The only reason you're not getting up earlier and spending more time in prayer is because there's something in your life holding you back. The reason you're not more like Jesus right now is because there's stuff in your life holding you back. And the only way to become more like Jesus, the only way to go further in your walk with God, is to go to the altar and put on that altar anything that stands between you and where God wants you to be. You can make all the commitments in the world to be a better prayer, but if you don't get your pride and self out of your life, all the commitments in the world won't make any difference. Yeah, it doesn't. You know what? I've just watched that with people. We think that somehow I just need to add more things to my life and I'll be more like Jesus. But typically, to become more like Jesus, you have to remove things from your life. And for that, you have to go to an altar. And so God is saying, if you want to go to another level in your walk with God, Abraham, you got to go to an altar first. And folks, let me tell you something. If Abraham could be 115 and still need to go to the altar, and he was a friend of God's, then guess what? You and I need to make regular trips to the altar too. Because there's just stuff in our life that still holds us back from being the kind of Christian we could be if we didn't have all this dead weight still holding us back. And you know what I've discovered that kind of worries me is that the studies show that as you get older, who you are gets kind of set in stone. You become a stronger version of whatever you were like. So if you're a very kind person as a young woman, a young man, as you get older, you become that real kind older person. But if you were a gossip when you were young, guess what you become as you get older? An even worse gossip. You're just a complete gossip now. If you were a prideful, boastful person, as you get older, you just bore everybody to tears, bragging about yourself and what you did. If you were a person who loved to serve others, as you get older, you just enjoy it more and more. If you loved worshiping God when you were young, as you get older, you just enjoy it all the more. And so, I tell you what, that might encourage you, it might frighten you to think that whatever bad habits you had as a young person, if you haven't gone to the altar and gotten rid of it, it's going to get set harder and harder in stone, where it gets more and more difficult to get rid of it. That's why you want to get rid of as much as you can while you're younger, because when you get older, it sort of calcifies. You know, my mother was a very generous person. Both my parents were. But my mother, as she got older and older, I'll tell you what, we had to be careful, because if you said to your mom, if you admired something in her place, she'd, well, why don't you just take it? It's like, well, I wasn't trying to ask for it, I'm just trying to admire it. But she was just giving stuff away, giving jewelry away. When she died 2 years ago, we went to kind of like sort out all of her jewelry to give it to all the women and the relatives, and most of it was gone. She'd given it all away. And she was just this generous person that the older she got, she just delighted in giving. But you know, also we have bad habits. My dad is the greatest man of God that I've ever known. But he had a bad habit. And that bad habit was he had this raging sweet tooth. And when he was younger, you just find little candy wrappers in the car. Like, Dad, you were buying the candies? He loved donuts and cookies. And so there was a series in his life where he was always kind of overweight a little bit. He was never just fat or obese, but he was heavy. And he could have lost some weight, but as he got, and we would talk to him about that. My mom was always saying, Dad, Henry, just stay away from those donuts. And you certainly don't need to eat 3 donuts, just 1 donut. But Dad, and there were times when he was younger where he would try to do better, and I've even seen in his prayer journals where he'd say, Lord, help me to show more control over cookies. But you know what? He never got over top of that. As he got older, he had less and less control. And to the point in later years when I would travel with him, or Rick would travel with him, it's like a security guard. I had to stand between him and the tray of cookies at the check-in counter at the hotel. Or he'd be putting them in his pockets just to have for later. And I'm like, Dad, can you not? Some people, it's women, it's money that takes them down. I said, my dad's going to get taken down because of a donut. Like, just, have control. Well, ultimately he came down with type 2 diabetes, and his blood sugar would get so high sometimes that he could hardly have a coherent thought. And I just thought, Dad, you should have gotten that under control when you were young. And now he just didn't really care. And right until the last day of his life, he was still taking insulin 3 or 4 times a day. Not because he had to originally, but he just never got on top of that addiction to sugar. And it used to frustrate the tar out of me that my dad could not walk past a donut. He just couldn't do it. And I said, well, you could have, if you just ask God to give you. He could get up at 4 in the morning and pray for 4 hours, but he couldn't walk past a cookie. It's like, Lord, he just needed to go to the altar one more time and just get rid of that. Do you have something like that in your life? What happens over time, maybe it's a temper. You know what we do when we get older? We start saying, well, I've just always had a problem with that. I've just always struggled with my temper. I've always struggled with this. I've just never been very good at that. And instead of going to the altar and letting God give us victory over it, we just sort of assume that's just how we're always going to be. Folks, I'll tell you what, Abraham was 115 and God was saying, get back to the altar. There's still some more I want to do in your life. You're not entirely free yet. But until you're just like God, you need to keep making trips back to that. Or you're never too old for you to need to go back to the altar. And God just said, there's just this little area over here. And we might have dealt with a lot of the big stuff. Like my dad, it wasn't like it was other women that was his issue. It wasn't pornography. It was a seemingly small thing. I think that's why Dad never got rid of it. He just thought it's just a cookie, Richard. I don't watch things I shouldn't. I don't gamble. I don't do all these things. But Dad, that little cookie is it's going to harm your life. And it's going to restrict what you could have done for God. And he just never felt like he needed to go to the altar for that. And it cost him. And it frustrated his family to watch him not be all that he could have been had he just let God give him victory over that. It doesn't mean he never ate a cookie. But if you'd see my dad, he couldn't stop eating cookies. And I just thought, a great man of God who's been to the altar for so many things, but this one area of his life, he never had victory in. My parents, as they got older, our tests change as we get older, don't they? When you're 20, you have certain tests in your life that God will let you face. When you're 60, 70, 80, the tests change, but there's still tests, right? And of course, I've got several degrees. I had tests in kindergarten to see if I could, finish coloring in things and knew my colors. And I ultimately got a PhD. The tests changed from kindergarten to PhD. But when I was 5, those kindergarten tests were quite challenging to me. As you get older, the tests change, but they're right where you're at this moment. And I found as a senior citizen I still have tests. And the only difference now is I've got an audience watching. You see, when it says God tested Abraham, I've often thought to myself, well, who was the test for? Was it for God? Was God trying to find out something? Did he want to learn something? I don't think so. I think God knew exactly what was in Abraham's heart. He didn't need to send him up a mountain to know the condition of Abraham's heart. God already knew. So I don't think God needed this test. Did Abraham need the test? Did Abraham have to decide, is God more important to me than even my own son? Well, maybe he needed to know that. But I'll tell you what, the way he passed that test, I don't think that was really an issue for Abraham either. So who was the test for? Well, think if you were Isaac. And let's just think for a moment, if Isaac is 15 years old, then that means Abraham is 115. Now try to imagine if all of a sudden a 115-year-old man tries to tie up a 15-year-old boy. Is that going to happen? Can you catch a 15-year-old boy? Come here, son, I'm going to tie you up. Offer you the sacrifice. Where are you going, son? But Isaac apparently trusts his dad so much, he's willing to let his own father bind him and place him on an altar. You never hear that Isaac struggled. If I was Isaac, I'd be squirming off that altar. I'd be trying to do whatever I could to get that rope free. You never hear of that. When that test was over, what do you think Isaac concluded? There's no doubt in my mind, my dad loves God more than he loves me. There's no doubt in my mind that there's nothing my dad would not do for God. Nothing. What do you think that did to Isaac? I think Isaac went away saying, I want to be a man of God just like my dad. Folks, the test that you're facing right now, a lot of your kids and grandkids are sitting in the front row watching how you handle the test. And it may be more for them than it is for you. Sometimes you wonder, Lord, I love you, I'm serving you. Why do I have this ailment? Why do I have this illness? Why do I have this pain? And you think, God, it would be so much easier to worship you if I could stand up and not have a bad back. And God might say, well, I know it would be for you, but I want to teach a lesson to your grandchild. That you can worship God even when you're filled with pain. You can worship God when you don't feel good anymore. You can worship God when they don't even play the kind of music that you like. You can still have joy nonetheless. You're teaching a lesson to them. You know, my parents, they traveled around the world. And they were in 115 different countries. They went into some very dangerous places. They were almost killed a couple times. They were in the White House a number of times. But as they got older, when they were in their 80s, and they were always willing to go wherever God told them to go. They had a great church in California. God said, walk away from that church. Go to a little struggling church in Canada with 10 people in it, and just trust me to provide for your family. And they did. They just got up and left. Every time God ever told them to go anywhere, they would just go. But now they're 80, in their 80s. And it got to the point where they couldn't manage their house anymore. They lived just down the street from me, but I'll tell you, alarms were always going off. I was getting a call every day from my mother. This isn't working. Can you come? And I don't know what to do about this. And I get calls from the security company saying, the alarm's going off at your parents' place. Do you know what that is? And it just got to the point where it was too much for them. And so we had to talk with them about moving into an independent living place. Some of you may live in that. It's a beautiful place, not very far away. A lot of our people in our church live there. But it was hard for my parents. You travel the world, you've been independent all your life, and now you feel like God's saying, listen, just to help the kids out, to keep us safe, it's just time to make the move. And so, but I so admired my parents, because when that day came, they just said, we're going to do it. That's what we need to do. And just like they'd always done their whole life. It's like, well, now this is what God is telling us to do now. And so I helped them move into their place. And they're in their 80s. And it's time for dinner. You had dinner down in the dining room. You ordered what food you wanted. It was very nice. but they were nervous, like going to kindergarten for the first time. Here are these people who traveled to 115 countries, and they're nervous about walking down the hallway to the dining hall. It's like, I said, Mom, what's wrong? Well, what if we sit in the wrong place? What if we sit at someone else's table? We don't know what to do. And I said, well, I'll go with you. So I walked my parents down, just like they took me to kindergarten, my first day of kindergarten. Now I've taken my parents' first day of eating in the dining room. And we found a table. And my mother is an off-the-chart extrovert. She walks in a room full of strangers and she just thinks, look at all these friends I've never met before. You know, she just starts meeting all these people. She starts talking to all these people. And she's talking to this one lady and the man at the table with her. There's people from our church that have already residents there. And they came over to my mother and they said, oh, Marilyn, you might want to know, that woman you were talking to, she's not a Christian. She's not a churchgoer. My mom's like, oh, well, good. I've got someone to witness to then. They're like, well, you don't understand. That man that she is sitting at the table with, they're not married. They're living in carnality, in the independent living. They both have been previously married, and just the finances, whatever. They decided it was too complicated to get married, so they were just living together. These two senior citizens living together, and so my mother was warned not to, be careful, because these people are maybe the most notorious sinners in the entire independent living complex. And that's just like saying sick to a hound dog to my mother. So she'd go every day and go up and talk to this couple. And nobody else was talking to them. Well, all these church people, not talking to the most notorious sinners in the unit. And so, but my mother did. And so as my mom kind of got more comfortable, this couple, the only person that's being nice to them is my mother, my dad. So they invite my parents over to their house or to their unit for coffee one day. And cookies, I think. So my dad was excited about that. And so people are saying, you're going to go? You're going to go into that den of iniquity? Who knows what will happen in there? And why are you going? Asked my mother. She said, well, because they invited us. And so my parent, I asked my mom afterward, how was it? Oh, it was lovely, and we invited them to come to our church, and they said, well, his health wasn't really good enough for them to get out and go to our church. So my mom said, so Richard, this is what I did. I know our services are live streamed. So I invite them to come to our living room next Sunday. I need you to race over to our house from church and they didn't know how to pull YouTube up on their TV, so they said, you got to come put it up so that they can watch church with us in our living room. So I teach a Sunday school class in my church. As soon as that was done, I raced over to my parents' place. The couple was already in the living room, in their positions, the worst sinners in the whole housing complex. And I pulled it out. And they're watching our church service. My brother's the senior pastor. And I'm watching this woman, this hardened sinner. And I see her start wiping tears from her eyes. And a few weeks later, the man died. And that woman starts coming to church with my mother. And so all the other people in their home are coming up to my mom and saying, you know what, I'm not sure that lady over there is a believer either, Marilyn. You might want to go after her too. And all of a sudden, my mother, who's traveled the world doing mission work, is so excited about this mission field here in her independent living home, where now she's got a new assignment from God. Even in her 80s, God's saying, no, your work's not done yet. There's still more for you to do. It might not be like it was 20 years ago, but that's an eternal soul, just like the ones in Africa used to go talk to. That woman has an eternity before her too. Are you willing to minister to her? Well, my mother 2 years ago, in this month, found out that she had liver cancer. And it was inoperable. She only had 2 months to live. They said she had 3 to 6 months. She had 2. And she was declining very rapidly. And she got to the point she couldn't leave her place, couldn't go to church even anymore. It was just too hard. And so I would go over there, and every Sunday I'd pull church up for them so they could watch it on their TV, and I'd just minister to them. And I've got a daughter who's a young lady in her early 30s, Carrie, And I said, one day she knew I was going to go. I teach a Sunday school class at my church first. And two of my kids are in my class. And so my daughter, knowing that right after Sunday school I was going to go to see my parents. You know, my daughter, she's a young 30-year-old mother of two, of those two granddaughters you saw. And she loves her grandma. She just admires her grandma so much. And she knew she was dying. But she didn't know what to do. How do I comfort Grandma, who's the greatest woman of God I know, who's dying now? So one day she heard I was going to go see her, and my daughter said, "Dad, can I come with you? I'm nervous to go by myself, but if you're going, can I just go with you?" So I said, "Sure, come on." So we took my daughter over to they're sitting in their chairs like that, and I got there and I said, "Mom, how you doing?" And that day she didn't have any shoes or socks on her feet, and she had blood clots, and her one foot was really hurting. And my mom had all these, none of you do this, but she had all these different crazy remedies that she picked up over the years. And you know, you never want to tell your mom that you had an ailment of any kind, because she would go and pull out some oil or vapor or wrap or something, or vitamin, and she always had a bucket full of stuff. But the thing that she liked about the most was she had this foot lotion. And she just believed that if you could get stuff in your feet, it would go through your whole body, it would be wonderful. And so I can't tell you how many times I'd go over to my mom's over the years, and she'd say, "Listen, let me rub your feet." And I didn't want my mother to rub I got size 12 feet. You'd have to put the lotion on with a trowel, like it's just like huge feet. But she would insist. She rubbed my dad's feet all the time because he had diabetes and it was good for his feet. She'd rub my feet so many times. I never once ever saw anybody rub her feet. But she'd rubbed all of my siblings' feet, my dad's feet, multiple times. And so now my mom says, "My feet are killing me." And so I thought, "Hey, you've got that foot lotion. And you've been rubbing people's feet for years. Mom, this is your day. Today, your feet are going to get rubbed. Now I'm going to rub your feet." I said, "Where is that stuff?" And I'm looking around in her apartment, and I find the foot lotion stuff. And it's like, "All right, today, Mom, you deserve to get your feet rubbed like they've never been rubbed before." And all of a sudden, my daughter's with me. She just says, "No, Dad, no, no." I thought, "No, like why wouldn't I rub my mom's feet?" And my daughter says, "No, Dad, let me do that. That's something I can do." And so I took that picture of my daughter. That's my mother's oldest granddaughter. And she just lovingly, she found something she could do to show her grandma how much she admired her, how much she loved her. And my mother lived not even a month after that picture was taken. One of the last things that my daughter was able to do to her grandmother. And I keep that picture because even as my mother was dying, as my mother had a month left to live, she was still ministering and showing grace to her granddaughter. And I thought to myself, "Lord, right to my last day, I pray that those young lives and eyes watching me," I've got 8 grandkids now. Any good talk, you've got to work your grandkids in a picture somewhere in a sermon. Those are my 8. And I've said, I don't know how long that I will be around for them, but I want every one of their memories to be of Grandpa loving God with all his heart. And even when my back is hurting, even when I don't feel good, when I'd rather be home than in church standing and singing songs, I want my grandkids to look over and say, "But look, even when Grandpa was in pain, he still loved Jesus. He still wanted to worship God one more time. He still had a smile on his face when he thought of how marvelous the love of God is." And I pray that for you, you'd just be reminded that you've got audiences watching you too. And I hope that you're not known as the grumpy one, the one that never likes anything, the one who's getting upset because the pastor went 2 minutes late in a service. Instead, you're the ones that all the young people say, "Now there's a woman who loves Jesus. And she's been loving Jesus for 60 years, and she still can't get over how marvelous the love of God is." Some of us may need to go to the altar and just let God take some things in our life, even at our age, and say, you know what, enough is enough. Let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that, so that you're free to be the man or woman of God I've always wanted you to be. So take a moment. Just would you bow your head with me? I'm going to just pray with you. But just take just a moment and ask the Lord, Lord, what is it I need to take to the altar? What is my Isaac that perhaps I love more than I love you? I would never say that. I would never admit that I love anything more than you. But God, I sure get a lot more excited about my sports, my recreation, my vacations, Lord, than I get about you. Lord, forgive me. Let me go to that altar and settle some things between me and you. And Lord, if there's some habits I've just put up with for years, and it's just time to say, this is enough. As long as I walk with God, I should not still be struggling with this bad habit, this attitude, or this sin that I've tolerated far, far too long. Lord, it's time to go to Mount Moriah and leave some things there. So I'm free at this stage of my life to live the life that you want me to live. And I just pray for every grandchild represented in this room, every young person who knows us, Lord, that they would be inspired as they watch us, that they would also want to walk with God the same way. Lord, I'm just so grateful for a mother who could bless her grandkids so much that they actually argued over who would get to wash her feet. May we also be a blessing to the next generation in such a way they can't wait to sit at our feet and watch our walk with God as well. And I would pray this in Jesus' name.